Thank you very much, Njoya. I know those who told you not to recognize them. Veteran guerrillas and fighters for freedom and justice on our continent. Your Excellency, Professor Mike Okwe, I discovered you're also Aaron today, despite many years of following you and being connected with you. Well, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to be here. We also recognize Lamin Mane, Dominic Sam, and also the representative of Dr. Amos Sawyer, who, as has been explained, was unable to join us at the last minute on account of a family emergency. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much, first and foremost, for accepting our invitation to be here to share your experience and expertise on a subject which, as the two previous speakers have indicated, is really at the very heart of development on our continent. And I'm delighted at the very high turnout of people who, in your various ways, otherwise very busy, especially at this time of the year as we begin to wind down the year, in order to kick off what we all hope in conceiving this initiative would be the beginning of a series of reflections on the issue of a new agenda, possibly framework for thinking and acting on governance issues on our continent. I think it's particularly delightful, as Lamin said in his concluding remarks, that the question of innovation of a continuing nature is particularly critical to any chance we might have of being successful in putting in place a governance architecture for our continent that actually does speak to our concerns on the continent. If there's any reproach, which I think we should make of ourselves, with regard to our attempts to understand and practice governance on the continent, including even creating ministries of good governance in at least 18 African countries at some point in time. Some of you may not remember that such ministries existed on this continent some 20 years, 25 years ago, almost like a contagion. We woke up and started creating ministries of good governance. I think, it's really that we have spent too much time believing that if we mimic others and immerse ourselves in an old, almost accustomed but never settled mentality of copycat, we might then somehow become like the others. Innovation in governance demands exactly what has been suggested in the concept note and what has been echoed here this morning already. That we have a deep understanding, first and foremost, of our history, that we have a deep understanding of the ethnography and sociology of our societies, understand where the pressure points are at any given point in time in the evolution of our societies, and put in place appropriate institutional arrangements that can enable us to minimize the points of friction and fracture and maximize the points of cohesion in a way that can enable both our policies to be governable and our developmental visions to be realized. If we step back a bit into history, 30 years ago, even 40 years ago, the preoccupation of the African Academy across the continent, in Legon, Kodesria, Dakar, in Addis Ababa, in Dar es Salaam, the so-called Dar es Salaam debates, which animated the community of African scholars and policy thinkers. A key question which was asked in the context of single party and military rule was, what went wrong that so soon after independence and all of the promise of the nationalist struggles that united people across the board, across the continent, we got it so wrong so quickly? What happened? As Mahmoud Mamdani was to put it, what happened that on the morrow of independence, as the vision that fired many a Pan-Africanist almost came to fruition, the disconnect between state and society began to emerge. So much so that the Ugandan poet Okot Pitek, speaking through the voice of the old woman in the song of Lawino, said to the politicians who took over state power at independence, to quote the old woman, according to Okot Pitek, leave me, leave me, leave me alone. After all, the Constitution says you should leave me alone. Or Wamba Dia Wamba, part of the Dar es Salaam school, saying soon after independence, looking at the example of his native Zaire, as it came to be known, DRC today, and of people saying, Zacharias, you remember, of people saying, when will independence finish? It was barely less than a decade after people were jubilating and dancing to celebrate the arrival of independence. And within a decade of independence, people had had enough of misrule and misgovernance that they began to ask visiting dignitaries sent to them by Mobutu and dancing, welcoming Mobutu himself, reading their speech to say how delighted they were to have him, but with one question to him: when will independence finish? So we can move on to other things. After all, colonialism came and finished. And we can't wait for this independence to finish because we don't recognize ourselves in it. Now, all of these culminated in discussions amongst African scholars. Wamba Dia Wamba, George Zongola, Mahmoud Mamdani, Issa Shivji. I can reel out any number of names of thinking African sociologists and political scientists who said that what seemed to be particularly problematic at independence was that in spite of all of the promise of a better life and a better future, which independence nationalism was meant to usher in, we actually did not sit down carefully to address questions of how to get the politics right in order to discipline power to the concerns of the populace. And as those issues began to come to a head and gain momentum, we entered into the years of crisis in the 70s, of structural adjustment knocking on the door. And the story of how we analyze the problem of the state-society disconnect that was spoken about in the concept note was turned on its head. Not so much from our own understanding of what seemed to be going wrong in state-society relations, but what the World Bank called getting prices right. If you don't remember that slogan, it means you are not born. Getting prices right. That became the slogan in every part of the continent you went to, with World Bank and IMF officials and their little briefcases, telling capital after capital, you must get prices right. The context for which was set by the Berg report, and subsequently followed up. And two competing ideas about the future of the continent. Are we to get politics right, or are we to get prices right? What prevailed was the World Bank view that we needed to get prices right. And structural adjustment was to be with us for the next 2.5 decades. But the World Bank technocrats are anything but stupid. They also contacted Claude Ake, the late Claude Ake, president of Codesria. They said, we've been hearing some things about getting politics right. What do you guys really mean about it? Can you do a concept note to explain what you mean? And for the first time in 1989, in the publication issued by the bank entitled Sub-Saharan Africa Towards an Accelerated Program of Growth, the World Bank quoted African scholars like Claude Ake and George Zongola and others, and used the notion, in inverted commas, of governance. Governance had moved from the fringes of the academy into the mainstream of the bank. It did not come out the same thing. I'm sorry. By the time the World Bank internalized the idea of governance and released it onto us as a new concept it had embraced, it was bereft of all politics and became all technicalities. Good governance, said the World Bank, is good for structural adjustment. If you again remember the slogan, Mikhail Gorbachev was in power at the time in the Soviet Union, and he was doing what he called perestroika, and then followed it up with glasnost. And then slogans about the party of the revolution, being the Communist Party, being a party both of perestroika and glasnost. And this was picked up by the World Bank, again, in case there were too many radicals like Mike Okwe at Legon, who would not want to do any business with the World Bank. They would quote the Communist Party for you of Soviet Union and tell you that Africa, no perestroika without glasnost. Google it. Africa, no perestroika without glasnost. And followed it up with another publication that attempting to carry out development, particularly within the framework of structural adjustment, without an agenda of governance reform, was like having Shakespeare's Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark. They embraced it. They embraced governance even more fanatically than us. But it was not what we meant that they meant. We thought of governance in terms of a root and branch reorganization of power and politics in post-independence Africa. They understood governance as an instrument for the achievement of the goals of structural adjustment. Two diametrically opposed ends, but using the language co-opted from us. And for the next 3 decades, we were setting up ministries of good governance that basically meant institutions which we could table before the international donor community and the IFIs in order to attract donor money. Usually pittance in relation to what we export from the continent, but nevertheless it became the name of the game. And for the rest of the 1990s into the new millennium, this was really the only game in town, good governance, and technical teams being sent out to advise our countries on how to achieve good governance, transparency, rule of law, predictability, institutional stability, everything was incorporated. With every new Nobel laureate in economics, the World Bank co-opted those things and added. So Douglas North on institutions, right? Douglas North won a Nobel laureate for his work on institutional economics. The army went to work. Africa's main problem is that there are no institutions. You need to build institutions. and that became part of the governance agenda. But mind you, all of this is also a case of saying, do what I say, but don't watch what I do. Because in the name of institutional reforms, we moved into a reorganization of the state in Africa, still in pursuit of the ideal of the free market, such that key institutions and agencies of government were either taken out of political scrutiny by citizens or completely dismantled as part of a broad agenda of privatization, commercialization, and deregulation. It's a quick anecdote. I was on a flight from Harare to Lusaka when these institutional reforms gained momentum. Had a ticket for Air Zambia. Chiluba was in power, was one of the experimental sites of the new institutional reforms taking place under the auspices of the World Bank. Got to Harare Airport, ready to go to Lusaka, and to be told that actually as of midnight, a decree was signed by President Chiluba, democratically elected president of multi-party Zambia, basically dissolving Air Zambia. I have the ticket as a permanent, lifelong grudge that I hold to this day against this kind of institutional reform. No explanation, no apology, no refund for that matter. But it spoke to the kind of pressure which governments came across the continent and which effectively resulted in what the UN was subsequently to describe as a process of governance reform that basically became an agencyfication of government, in which specialized government became a collection of specialized agencies taken out of the mainstream civil service, killing esprit de corps in the civil service, destroying the coherence and cohesion of the state system to a point where, by the end of the 1990s, Africa easily became the most undergoverned continent in the world. All the statistics are there. And whatever was left in the domain of the public was taken out of the scrutiny, even of elected politicians. So ideas about the independent central bank, for example, came in. You could no longer fire your central bank governor. They are supposed to be independent. And these governors were to be given only one task, one and only one task, contrary to what other central banks do around the world, including the Federal Reserve of the United States, spends 7/24 gazing at inflation. Inflation targeting. Gaze, don't worry about unemployment. Just stay focused on inflation. Make sure that there isn't too much money to make prices rise, and make sure that the markets are kept happy, that the fundamentals are right, that you have enough money to pay all of the repatriated resources that will need to leave our countries. This is what it has been about. And if after 25 years to almost 30 years since the demonstrations that began in Cotonou to usher in the current phase of multi-party politics on the continent, if after all of that period, Africans feel somewhat shortchanged by 30 years of democratic reform on our continent, I think we can easily understand that it has been a case of plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. It has been a case of so much motion. And it is true. It is true. Professor Oko is an academic, apart from being a statesman today. So when I turn and look at him, these were debates that he was involved in as a public intellectual in Accra in the heady days of the 80s and 90s, before going on to become ambassador in China. And you recall, sir, all of the discussions we were having about how to bring substance and content to this democratic reform process? How do we enrich this democratic reform process in a way as not to make it an empty barrel in which there will be so much sound and fury with a bit of drama and occasional panache, but at the end of the day leave the people feeling empty? Maybe we'll not be surprised if today we don't do something about it. On a continent where inequality is growing, on a continent where youth unemployment is way at a level that is acceptable to any decent society, and which suggests that we're actually sitting on a time bomb, in a place where it is easy to give $2.5 to young people and recruit them into jihadist armies. This is what we are living with, the reality that we live with. Of a continent where an urbanization process is taking place, in which population is drifting into urban conglomerate centers, mega cities, as the UN refers to them, of which at least there are 8 or 9 that have already emerged on the continent, from Dar es Salaam to Niamey to Kinshasa. And in the midst of this concentration of population, over 60% of the people do not wake up on a daily basis with a perspective of what the day will be like. Let's not even begin to talk of tomorrow. I don't want to sound like I'm being pessimistic, but I think that we have a problem. And the sooner we recognize that we have a problem and begin to step back from all of the cliched formulas that are given to us to tell us that this is how you do governance. People telling you this is how you do governance, who didn't do the same thing in their societies. Of a Federal Reserve which is focused on employment creation and inflation targeting, not just inflation targeting. Of governments that are interventionist and not simply sitting back and saying, let the free market do it. When the crisis broke out in the United States and Europe, 2007, 2008, who would have imagined that the United Kingdom will nationalize banks after 2 decades of teaching us that nationalization was a crime, almost like a crime against humanity? That the United States will print money and give it a sophisticated name called quantitative easing and tell us that you can't do the same thing. It is bad for inflation and you don't have the governance capacity to deal with it. These are the issues we are dealing with. And it is really up to us at the end of the day to accept these things or not to accept these things. I'd like to close by simply saying that the foundation on which we can build any transformative governance initiative on our continent, in my view, must proceed from a starting point of a shared and collective vision of society. Where do we want to see this Africa in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, depending on how far we want to go? What is the ideal of society that we want to see? What must be the bargain in being an African today and for tomorrow? Understanding that we live in a world in which, although many people convene us to dinners that are called Africa, Asia, Africa, China, Africa, Japan, Africa, US, Africa, Dubai, Africa, everything, and we troop there dutifully, even those of us who don't come for AU summits, and line up to be given a handshake, that we also attended the Africa-China summit and TICAD and all of those things. They don't owe us a living. They are basically working for their own people. They owe their people a living. They understand that you need to flatter the African a bit, and they will open the gate for you to take whatever you want to take out and call it friendship. We did it before. told them, settle here. And in the end, they pushed us out. They may not call it colonialism today, but the practices reported by the Mbeki Commission on illicit financial flows are anything short of being colonial arrangements. And we can only build a transformative governance initiative for ourselves if we define a vision of society in which we place a much greater value on the life and the contribution of the African in his or her own continent. And this is what I see as being at the heart of Pan-Africanism today, as the challenge of Pan-Africanism. What is the bargain in being an African, no matter where we find ourselves? What vision of society can we build and project collectively? And out of that, we begin to define what governance arrangements do we need to put in place. Not formula that people claim they used in order to transform themselves, which formula is actually stylized for our consumption, but never corresponding to what happened. But out of our own heads, with our own minds, as Cabral said, let us think and imagine a better Africa. Thank you.
Well, Prof, I told the audience that those of us who are students of governance are in for a treat today. Thank you very much. That was okay. It was okay. I think you can do better. Thank you. Thank you very, very much.